Logan Carter only wanted to park his aging truck outside the construction site long enough to deliver the final rescue vehicle part on time. But CEO Amelia Langford looked at him like a stain on her morning. Still bitter over an argument weeks earlier, she gave the order to have his truck towed, shattering the one contract that kept his small shop alive. Nobody guessed that truck was carrying proof of a safety fraud worth millions of dollars. By the time Logan walked into a courtroom, a single cold lawsuit was already ending Amelia Langford's career forever that very day. If you want to know exactly what secret that old truck was hiding, stay with this story until the end. The morning sun had barely climbed over the skyline when Logan Carter pulled his weathered pickup truck into the loading lane outside the construction site for Langford Infrastructure. The truck was old, its paint faded to a dull gray, its bed lined with tools that had seen 2 decades of honest work. But inside that truck sat something far more important than its appearance suggested, a hydraulic brake assembly destined for a fleet of urban rescue vehicles, a part Logan had personally tested and certified before making the drive across town. He was not a wealthy man. He ran a small independent repair shop on the edge of the industrial district, a place held together by long hours and a reputation for doing things right. That truck, rusted as it looked, was the single most valuable asset his business owned, the vehicle that carried parts, tools, and promises to every client who trusted him. He checked his delivery slip one more time before stepping out, making certain every signature and stamp was in order. The rescue vehicle contract had taken him months to secure, and losing it would mean losing nearly everything he had built. As he walked toward the gate with the part cradled carefully in his arms, a line of black luxury vehicles rolled into the site, polished and gleaming under the morning light. Amelia Langford stepped out of the lead car, dressed for a meeting with investors who were touring the facility that very afternoon. She scanned the site with the practiced eye of someone who cared deeply about appearances, and what she saw first was not the concrete or the cranes or the workers in their vests. What she saw was Logan's old gray truck parked directly in the sightline of the entrance, exactly where her guests would walk within the hour. Her jaw tightened. She asked one of her assistants who had allowed a vehicle like that to sit so close to the main gate, and before anyone could answer properly, she was already walking toward Logan herself, heels clicking against fresh pavement. Logan turned to greet her, calm and polite, holding up his delivery paperwork as proof that he belonged exactly where he stood. He explained that he was delivering a certified brake component for the city's rescue fleet, a delivery that had been scheduled and approved weeks earlier through proper procedure. Amelia barely glanced at the papers in his hand. Her eyes were fixed on the truck itself, on its dented fender and its cracked windshield, and on what it might suggest to visitors who judged a company by the smallest details. She told him, in a tone that left no room for negotiation, that his truck was an eyesore and needed to be moved immediately. Logan kept his voice steady, explaining that the delivery was time-sensitive and tied directly to public safety equipment awaiting installation. He offered to move the truck the moment the part was signed for, a matter of minutes rather than hours. Amelia was unmoved by the explanation, and something colder crept into her expression, a flicker of irritation that seemed to run deeper than a simple parking dispute. She called him a roadside mechanic in front of her assistants, the words landing sharp and deliberate, meant to remind him of his place in a world built for people like her. Logan did not flinch, though the insult settled uncomfortably in his chest. He simply repeated that the delivery mattered, that lives depended on the equipment functioning correctly, and that he intended to finish the job he had come to do. It was a small refusal, quiet and reasonable, but to Amelia Langford it felt like defiance she was not prepared to tolerate. What Amelia did not say out loud, though it burned quietly behind her composed expression, was that Logan Carter's name was already familiar to her, and not in a way she appreciated. Months earlier, he had submitted a formal report questioning the structural integrity of certain components used in the company's rescue vehicle program, a report that had caused friction between departments and required unwelcome explanations to city officials. In her mind, this small confrontation over a parked truck was not an isolated incident but a continuation of something personal. A man she believed was determined to undermine a contract worth a great deal to her company's reputation. She saw a delivery driver with dirty hands and a battered truck, and beneath that she saw a threat to everything she had worked to build. Connor Blake, the operations director standing nearby, sensed the tension and leaned in close to Amelia's ear. He reminded her, in a low and deliberate voice, that Logan Carter was the same man who had caused problems before, the same man whose complaints had already cost the company time and money. Connor suggested, almost casually, that someone like that needed to understand consequences, that letting him linger at the gate sent the wrong message to everyone watching. Amelia's anger, already simmering from the confrontation, found a convenient outlet in Connor's words. She turned to her assistant and gave an order that would ripple far beyond that single morning. Have the truck towed immediately, regardless of what papers the driver was holding. The tow truck arrived within the hour, summoned by a phone call made without any real regard for the legality of the delivery or the legitimacy of Logan's parking permit. Workers on site exchanged uneasy glances as the truck's owner protested, showing his documentation once more to operators who had clearly been instructed not to listen. The chains went around the frame of Logan's truck, and within minutes it was lifted and dragged away, its tools rattling loudly inside the bed, its precious cargo shifting dangerously with every jolt of the winch. Logan stood frozen for a moment, watching the one asset that mattered most to his livelihood disappear down the access road behind a stranger's truck. It was not simply a vehicle being removed. It was the collapse of a contract months in the making, the destruction of trust with a city agency that depended on timely, careful delivery. By the time the tow truck reached the impound lot, the damage had already been done in ways no one on site fully understood yet. The rough handling had cracked the housing of the brake assembly. Logan had carried so carefully, rendering it unusable for installation. Tools that had taken years to collect were scattered and damaged inside the truck bed, some falling loose entirely during transport. For Logan, the financial blow was immediate and severe, but the deeper wound was the realization that a single, spiteful decision made by someone with far more power than he possessed could unravel everything he had spent a lifetime constructing. His small shop, already operating on thin margins, now faced the very real possibility of closing its doors within weeks if the rescue vehicle contract could not be salvaged. Word of the incident spread quickly across the construction site, and by mid-morning several workers had gathered near the gate to watch the aftermath unfold. Some laughed quietly as Logan jogged a short distance after the departing tow truck, his arms raised in a futile attempt to stop what had already been set in motion. It was a humiliating scene, made worse by the presence of investors arriving for their scheduled tour, several of whom glanced curiously at the commotion before being ushered inside by Amelia's assistants. Amelia herself remained near the entrance, arms crossed, watching the spectacle with an expression that suggested satisfaction rather than regret. When one of the site supervisors asked quietly whether the truck's owner had truly been in the wrong, she replied without hesitation that a man like that should never have believed he could stand in the way of people who had actually built something. Logan did not raise his voice or demand an apology, though every instinct told him the situation was deeply unjust. Instead, he pulled out his phone and began documenting everything methodically, timestamps, photographs of the empty space where his truck had been parked, and the faces of witnesses who might later confirm what they had seen. He understood, even in that moment of anger and loss, that emotional outbursts would accomplish nothing against a company with Langford's resources and legal team. What he needed was proof, and proof required patience rather than confrontation. He noted the license plate of the tow truck, the name stenciled faintly on its door, and the exact time the vehicle had been dragged away from a legally designated loading zone. It was only later that afternoon, standing in the impound lot surrounded by damaged equipment, that Logan remembered something crucial about his own truck. Months earlier, after a minor theft at his shop, he had installed a small dashboard camera system designed to record continuously whenever the engine was running or the vehicle was being moved. The device was modest, inexpensive, purchased more out of caution than any expectation of dramatic use, but it had almost certainly captured the entire confrontation at the gate. He also remembered the small hard drive tucked beneath the driver's seat, containing the very safety testing data that had started the friction between himself and Langford infrastructure months before. That data, gathered through entirely legal and independent testing, documented brake performance results that told a story very different from what the company had reported to city officials. Sitting in the impound lot office, waiting for paperwork to release his damaged vehicle, Logan felt something shift inside him, a quiet resolve replacing the initial shock of humiliation. He was not a man prone to dramatic gestures or public outrage, but he understood now that this was no longer only about a parking dispute or a bruised sense of dignity. The truck that had been dragged away in front of laughing onlookers carried within it evidence that could expose a much larger problem, one involving public safety and corporate deception at a scale far beyond a single mechanic's grievance. For the first time since the morning began, Logan allowed himself to believe that the story was not over, that the humiliation he had endured might eventually become the very thing that unraveled the people responsible for it. He thought, too, of the people who depended on him back at the shop and the customers whose safety rested on parts he tested with his own hands, long before any of this became a matter for lawyers or courtrooms. That thought steadied him more than any promise of vindication could have. Somewhere beneath the anger and the bruised pride was a simpler feeling. The plain conviction that the truth mattered regardless of who was inconvenienced by it, and that conviction was enough to carry him through the long drive home that evening. By the time Logan finally drove the battered truck back to his shop that evening, the sun had long since set behind the industrial buildings that lined his street. He parked slowly, almost gently, as if the vehicle itself needed comfort after the abuse it had endured. Inside the shop, the fluorescent lights hummed over workbenches cluttered with half-finished projects, tools he had collected over more than 15 years of steady, careful labor. He walked through the space in silence, taking inventory of everything the day had cost him, a task that felt less like accounting and more like grief. The brake assembly meant for the rescue fleet was destroyed beyond repair, a loss that would need to be reported to the city agency waiting for delivery. Several hand tools had been damaged during the rough towing process, their handles cracked, their precision compromised in ways that made them unsafe to use. Within days, the consequences of that single morning began arriving in the form of phone calls and letters. A regular client who relied on Logan for fleet maintenance called to say they were taking their business elsewhere after hearing rumors about unreliability, rumors that had somehow already spread through the tightly connected world of local contractors. Another message arrived from the city agency overseeing the rescue vehicle contract, informing him that failure to deliver certified parts on schedule would result in financial penalties as outlined in their original agreement. Logan read the letter twice, feeling the weight of numbers he knew his small business could not easily absorb. He had built his reputation on reliability, on being the mechanic who never missed a deadline, and now that reputation felt as fragile as the cracked windshield still sitting in his truck bed. Despite the mounting pressure, Logan did not allow himself to spiral into panic or despair. He approached the disaster the way he approached every mechanical problem that crossed his workbench, methodically and without wasted emotion. He photographed every piece of damaged equipment, cataloged every canceled contract, and kept careful records of every conversation related to the incident. He understood instinctively that emotion alone would not rebuild what had been lost, but documentation might eventually provide the foundation for something far more powerful than an apology. Late that night, after locking up the shop, he sat at his small kitchen table and made a phone call he had been putting off since the moment the tow truck disappeared down the road. The call was to Mason Reed, a civil litigation attorney Logan had known for years, ever since Mason's aging sedan had broken down outside the shop on a rainy evening, and Logan had repaired it free of charge, refusing payment from a stranger who clearly could not afford the expense at the time. Mason answered on the second ring, his voice warm with genuine concern once he understood the situation. As Logan explained everything, from the confrontation at the gate to the destroyed brake component to the safety report he had filed months earlier, Mason grew quiet on the other end of the line, the kind of quiet that signaled careful, serious thought rather than disinterest. When he finally spoke again, his shifted entirely, sharp and focused, the voice of a man who recognized something far larger than a simple dispute over parking. This was not merely wrongful towing, he explained. This looked like retaliation against a person who had raised legitimate safety concerns, layered on top of possible efforts to conceal a serious defect in equipment meant to protect the public. Mason Reed did not waste time once he agreed to take the case. Within a week, he had drafted and filed a formal complaint against Amelia Langford personally, against Langford Infrastructure as a company, and against the towing operator whose crew had removed Logan's truck without proper legal justification. The complaint outlined several distinct claims, beginning with destruction of property and interference with a valid business contract, moving through allegations of retaliation against an individual who had raised legitimate safety concerns through proper procedure, and culminating in a request for discovery related to potential concealment of known equipment defects. Mace built the filing carefully, aware that each claim would need to withstand aggressive scrutiny from a legal team backed by substantial corporate resources. When the papers reached Amelia's desk, she read through them with something closer to amusement than concern. She could not imagine that a small shop mechanic possessed the financial means to sustain a prolonged legal battle against a company with her resources, and she said as much during a meeting with her general counsel later that same day. She instructed her legal team to file an aggressive countersuit, one designed to paint Logan as a disgruntled former contractor attempting to extort money from a legitimate business through fabricated claims and manipulated evidence. The strategy, as she explained it, was simple: overwhelm him with legal costs and public embarrassment until he abandoned the case entirely, the way she assumed most people in his position eventually did. Her legal team moved quickly, drafting statements that questioned Logan's credibility, suggesting his earlier safety report had been motivated by professional jealousy rather than genuine concern. Press releases went out framing the situation as an unfortunate misunderstanding involving an overzealous delivery driver who had refused reasonable instructions from site personnel. Amelia believed, with the confidence of someone accustomed to winning, that the narrative would settle in her favor within a matter of weeks. What she did not anticipate was Mason's calm, methodical approach to the case, an approach built not on public statements or media strategy but on the quiet accumulation of verifiable facts. Mason's first formal request to the court was for a preservation order, a legal mechanism requiring Langford Infrastructure to retain and produce all relevant records related to the incident. This included internal emails discussing the towing decision, dashboard camera footage from company vehicles present at the site, and any technical documentation related to the rescue vehicle brake systems under dispute. The request was routine on its surface, the kind of procedural step attorneys filed as a matter of course in nearly every civil case. But for Amelia, sitting in her office reviewing the court's response, something about the language of the order began to feel less like a formality and more like the first crack in a foundation she had always assumed was unshakable. For the first time since the confrontation at the gate, a small flicker of genuine uncertainty crossed her mind, though she was not yet willing to admit it, even to herself. The dashboard camera Logan had installed months earlier turned out to be far more valuable than he could have imagined during that first frantic moment at the impound lot. When Mason's technical consultant extracted the footage, it revealed the entire confrontation in clear, unedited detail, including the exact words Amelia had used when she gave the order to have the truck removed. The recording captured her irritation, her dismissive tone, and most critically, the moment she instructed her assistant to have the vehicle towed immediately without regard for the delivery paperwork Logan had presented. There was no ambiguity in the footage, no room for the alternative narrative her legal team had been constructing in press releases and court filings. Even more damaging was a second recording captured by the camera's cabin microphone, which had continued running as the truck sat idle near the gate before the towing began. In the background of that audio, faint but distinguishable, once enhanced by forensic technicians, Connor Blake's voice could be heard speaking to another site manager, warning that Logan Carter should not be allowed to inspect or verify the rescue vehicle system components currently being installed. The remark, made casually and without any apparent awareness of the recording, suggested a level of concern about scrutiny that went far beyond simple irritation over a parking dispute. It hinted at something deliberate, an effort to keep specific information away from the one person capable of identifying a problem. The hard drive Logan had stored beneath his seat provided the final and most damning piece of the puzzle. It contained the complete results of independent brake testing he had conducted months earlier, testing that showed the manufacturer-certified components performed exactly as required under sustained heavy load conditions. But the data also included comparison figures for components actually installed in several rescue vehicles already delivered to the city, figures that revealed a troubling substitution. Somewhere between certification and installation, cheaper aftermarket parts had replaced the tested components, parts that showed measurable performance degradation under the same stress conditions. If deployed in an actual emergency involving heavy loads, the substituted brakes carried a real risk of failure, a risk that could cost lives rather than simply money. Mason wasted no time forwarding the technical findings to the relevant Transportation Safety Authority, understanding that this discovery elevated the case far beyond a straightforward civil dispute between two parties. Around the same time, an investigative journalist named Evelyn Moore, who had been quietly tracking irregularities in several municipal infrastructure contracts, received an anonymous tip pointing toward Langford Infrastructure and the ongoing lawsuit. Evelyn had built her career on patient, careful reporting, the kind that avoided sensationalism in favor of verified fact, and something about this particular tip felt substantial enough to warrant a closer look. She began making calls, requesting public records, and quietly building a timeline that would soon intersect directly with the legal battle already unfolding in the courts. She spent evenings cross-referencing procurement records against public safety filings, noting discrepancies that no one outside the company had ever thought to question. Each new document added another layer to a story that was quickly outgrowing the narrow frame of a single lawsuit, becoming instead a broader account of how easily convenience could override caution when no one was watching closely enough to notice the difference. As the legal process ground forward, Amelia doubled down on her public offensive, convinced that shaping perception could still overwhelm whatever evidence Mason's team was gathering behind closed doors. She arranged a press conference outside the Langford Infrastructure headquarters, standing confidently before a small crowd of reporters while framing Logan as a bitter, unstable contractor who had manufactured a conflict in hopes of extracting a financial settlement from a company he resented. She spoke of the rescue vehicle program with practiced pride, emphasizing the jobs it created and the lives it was meant to protect, carefully avoiding any mention of the technical concerns buried within Mason's filings. Her communications team pushed the narrative aggressively across local media outlets, framing the lawsuit as an attack on a company trying to do good work for the community. The campaign had an immediate, tangible effect on Logan's business. Several clients who had remained loyal through the initial disruption now began to waver, unsettled by headlines suggesting he might be dishonest or unstable. A longtime customer canceled a maintenance contract that had sustained the shop through slower months, citing concerns about being associated with ongoing litigation and public controversy. Logan absorbed each loss quietly, refusing to respond to reporters or engage publicly with Amelia's accusations, trusting instead in the slow, deliberate process Mason had assured him would eventually reveal the truth. It was a difficult trust to maintain while watching years of careful reputation building erode under the weight of a coordinated public relations campaign. Not everyone within Langford Infrastructure remained convinced by Amelia's confident public performance. Grace Langford, who served as chairwoman of the company's board and happened to be Amelia's own mother, began noticing troubling patterns in the company's financial reports. Investor confidence had started to slip in the weeks following the lawsuit's filing, and several major shareholders had quietly requested additional information about the rescue vehicle contract's technical specifications. Grace had built the company from far humbler beginnings decades earlier, and she recognized the early signs of a crisis that public relations alone could not resolve. She began asking pointed questions during board meetings, questions Amelia answered with increasing impatience and decreasing detail. Behind the scenes, Connor Blake grew increasingly nervous as the preservation order took full effect, restricting his ability to alter or remove any documentation related to the brake component substitution. He attempted, quietly and without authorization, to delete several internal files referencing the change in suppliers, hoping to eliminate any digital trail connecting the decision back to his department. Fortunately for the case, Mason's legal team had already secured copies of the relevant server backups through the court-ordered preservation process, rendering Connor's efforts largely futile. When forensic technicians later discovered the deletion attempts, it only added another troubling data point, suggesting a coordinated effort to conceal information from investigators and the court. The courtroom felt smaller than Logan had imagined it would, its wood-paneled walls closing in around a room already crowded with attorneys, court staff, and a handful of reporters who had taken interest in the case following Evelyn Moore's initial published inquiries. Amelia's legal team arrived in coordinated dark suits, projecting an air of confident authority that had served them well in countless previous disputes. Their opening strategy focused heavily on undermining Logan's credibility, suggesting to the court that he had a documented history of conflict with construction site management and a personal grudge against Langford Infrastructure stemming from his earlier rejected safety report. They painted him as an unreliable narrator, someone whose account of events could not be trusted without independent corroboration. Mason rose calmly when his turn came, requesting permission to present video evidence obtained through the court's preservation order. The dashboard camera footage played across the courtroom's display screen, and a hush settled over the room as Amelia's own voice, clear and unmistakable, ordered the towing of Logan's truck despite acknowledging the delivery paperwork he had presented moments earlier. The footage left little room for the alternative narrative her attorneys had constructed, showing plainly that the decision had been personal and immediate rather than procedural or justified by any legitimate site safety concern. Several jurors exchanged glances as the recording concluded, their expressions shifting from neutral curiosity towards something closer to skepticism directed at the defense table. The court then ordered Langford Infrastructure to produce internal communications related to the incident and the broader rescue vehicle contract, a demand the company's attorneys attempted unsuccessfully to narrow or delay. Among the documents eventually surrendered was an email written by Connor Blake to a colleague in the procurement department containing a single damaging line that Mason read aloud for the record: "Do not let Carter verify the brake system again." The sentence hung in the courtroom air, its implications obvious even to those unfamiliar with the technical details of the case. It suggested unmistakably that someone within the company had specific reasons to keep Logan away from equipment he had every legal right to inspect as part of his original delivery contract. Amelia's face remained composed throughout most of the proceeding, though those seated close enough could see the tension building in her jaw as each piece of evidence accumulated against her position. When finally given the opportunity to respond, she attempted to shift responsibility toward Connor and the procurement department, claiming she had no direct knowledge of any decision regarding component substitution or restricted inspection access. Logan, seated quietly beside Mason throughout the entire hearing, said almost nothing, offering only brief, measured answers when directly questioned by the court. His restraint stood in sharp contrast to the increasingly defensive posture of the executive across the room, and several observers later noted that his quiet consistency seemed to carry more weight with the jury than any dramatic testimony could have achieved. A few weeks into the proceedings, Mason received an unexpected phone call from a man named Jason Miller, a former engineer who had once worked directly on the rescue vehicle program before leaving the company under circumstances he described as forced rather than voluntary. Jason explained that he had been terminated after raising formal objections to a decision made higher up the chain of command, a decision to replace certified brake components with cheaper alternatives in order to meet an aggressive production timeline. At the time, he had assumed his concerns would simply disappear into corporate silence, but hearing about the ongoing lawsuit through local news coverage convinced him it was finally time to speak openly about what he had witnessed. When Jason took the stand, his testimony carried a weight that surprised even Mason, who had prepared extensively for his appearance. He described in careful technical detail the exact process by which certified components had been swapped for lower-cost alternatives, explaining the performance differences under stress conditions in terms the jury could clearly understand. He confirmed without hesitation that Logan's earlier safety report had raised precisely the concerns that should have prompted a full company investigation rather than dismissal and quiet retaliation. His account aligned perfectly with the technical data already presented from Logan's hard drive, lending independent credibility to findings that Amelia's team had previously dismissed as fabricated or exaggerated. Jason also brought something Mason had not anticipated: a partial recording of an internal meeting he had attended before his termination, captured on his personal phone during a period when he suspected his concerns were being deliberately ignored. In the recording, Amelia's voice could be heard discussing the component substitution directly, acknowledging the associated risks while emphasizing the importance of maintaining the project's delivery schedule for investor confidence. It was the clearest evidence yet that she had possessed direct knowledge of the safety compromise long before the confrontation at the gate, undermining her repeated claims of ignorance regarding decisions made within her own company. The revelation sent a visible ripple through the courtroom, and within hours reporters covering the case were filing updated stories that framed the situation in far more serious terms than the earlier narrative of a simple parking dispute gone wrong. Evelyn Moore, who had been attending nearly every session of the trial, published a detailed article synthesizing the testimony, the recovered audio, and the broader pattern of concealment that had begun to emerge across multiple sources. Public opinion, which had initially leaned towards sympathy for a respected local executive, began shifting rapidly as the full scope of the safety compromise became impossible to ignore. Amelia's carefully constructed reputation, built over years of calculated public appearances, started cracking under scrutiny that no press release could adequately contain. Even colleagues who had once defended her privately began distancing themselves, unwilling to be associated publicly with decisions that now appeared to have knowingly endangered the very emergency crews the company claimed to support. The distance between the woman who had once commanded a room with a single glance and the executive now facing hostile questions from reporters grew wider with each passing day, and there was little her communications team could do to close that gap through carefully worded statements alone. The fallout from Jason Miller's testimony reached the boardroom of Langford Infrastructure faster than anyone anticipated, and within days Grace Langford called an emergency session of the full board of directors. Several major investors, alarmed by the mounting evidence and the corresponding drop in share value, demanded a formal explanation regarding the company's handling of the rescue vehicle contract and the ongoing litigation surrounding it. The mood inside the boardroom was tense, far removed from the confident atmosphere that had characterized company meetings only months earlier. Grace sat at the head of the table, her expression unreadable, listening as representatives from the largest investment firms voiced their growing concerns about liability, regulatory exposure, and irreparable damage to the company's public standing. One senior investor spoke plainly, suggesting that Amelia step back from active leadership while the investigation ran its course, a request framed diplomatically but carrying unmistakable weight given the financial influence behind it. Amelia's response was immediate and defensive, insisting the entire situation had been orchestrated by a disgruntled contractor seeking financial gain, aided by a former employee with an obvious grudge against the company that had let him go. She accused the board of abandoning her prematurely, of allowing a moment of media pressure to override years of loyalty and demonstrated leadership. Her voice rose slightly as she spoke, a departure from her usual composed demeanor, and several board members exchanged uncomfortable glances at the visible crack in her control. Connor Blake, sensing the direction the meeting was heading, attempted a quiet maneuver of his own, forwarding select internal documents to Amelia's personal legal counsel in an apparent effort to consolidate blame away from himself and toward decisions he claimed had originated from executive leadership rather than operational management. The gesture, intended as protection, only deepened suspicions among board members already questioning how deeply the deception ran within the company's upper ranks. Grace watched the exchange unfold with growing concern, recognizing that continued denial and internal finger-pointing would only accelerate the damage rather than contain it. By the meeting's conclusion, Grace made a decision that surprised many in the room, though it aligned entirely with the pragmatic instincts that had guided her through decades of building the company from modest beginnings into a major infrastructure firm. Rather than continuing to shield her daughter from consequences, she announced that Langford Infrastructure would fully cooperate with the ongoing court proceedings, providing complete access to internal records and communications, regardless of how damaging the findings might prove. It was, in her view, the only path that offered any possibility of salvaging what remained of the company's reputation and its relationships with the city agencies that depended on its work. Amelia sat in stunned silence as her mother spoke, realizing for the first time that the protection she had always assumed would be there was no longer guaranteed. The final phase of the trial arrived with the courtroom fuller than it had been at any previous session, reporters and curious onlookers filling seats that had once held only a handful of spectators. Mason stood before the jury and laid out the complete narrative he had spent months assembling, beginning with the seemingly small decision to have a legally parked truck towed out of personal spite, and tracing the consequences forward through canceled contracts, damaged equipment, and a coordinated campaign to discredit a man who had done nothing more than deliver certified safety equipment on schedule. He reminded the jury that this had never been simply about a truck or a parking dispute, but about the deliberate targeting of someone who had raised legitimate concerns through proper procedure, only to be punished rather than heard. Mason walked through each piece of evidence methodically, connecting the dashboard footage to the internal emails, the testimony from Jason Miller to the recovered audio of Amelia acknowledging known safety risks, and the technical data proving that substituted components carried genuine danger for public safety vehicles already in service. He emphasized that Logan had lost far more than a single delivery or a damaged truck. He had lost contracts built over years of careful reputation, income that supported his small business and everyone who depended on it, and a measure of public trust that took considerable time and effort to rebuild once tarnished by a coordinated smear campaign. The scope of harm, Mason argued, extended well beyond typical civil damages into territory that demanded serious accountability from both the company and the individuals who had orchestrated the retaliation. Because the evidence revealed a documented, ongoing safety violation affecting vehicles already deployed for emergency response purposes, the case drew attention from the Transportation Safety Authority separate from the civil proceedings themselves. Regulators announced they would open a formal investigation into Langford Infrastructure's certification practices, a development that carried potential criminal implications for those found to have knowingly concealed the component substitution from oversight agencies. Amelia, facing both civil liability and the looming threat of criminal referral, watched her legal options narrow considerably as her attorneys advised her that continued denial was no longer a viable strategy given the weight of accumulated evidence. When the jury returned its verdict, the courtroom fell into a silence that felt heavier than any moment that had preceded it. Amelia was found liable on every major claim brought against her personally and against the company she had led, resulting in a substantial financial judgment and an immediate demand from the board that she step down from her position permanently rather than temporarily. Connor Blake faced separate legal consequences for his attempt to destroy evidence during an active investigation, an act that transformed his role from simple operational oversight into deliberate obstruction of justice. Logan received compensation that finally accounted for every contract lost, every tool damaged, and every month of hardship endured since that first confrontation at the gate. Yet when reporters asked him afterward what mattered most about the outcome, he spoke not of the settlement but of his insistence that the rescue vehicle program be corrected immediately, its dangerous components replaced before any emergency crew relied on equipment that might fail them when it mattered most. In the months that followed the verdict, Logan used a portion of his settlement to rebuild his shop from the ground up, replacing damaged tools and expanding the small operation just enough to bring back 2 mechanics who had lost their positions elsewhere during the difficult stretch when his own business nearly collapsed. He remained careful with the money, unwilling to let sudden financial relief change the disciplined habits that had carried him through years of quiet, steady work. The shop reopened its doors with little fanfare, no press conference or public celebration. Just the familiar sound of tools against metal and the steady rhythm of honest labor resuming after months of disruption. Grace Langford, true to the commitment she had made before the board, personally visited Logan's shop not long after the case concluded, arriving without the entourage of assistants that typically accompanied her public appearances. She offered a direct, unembellished apology for the harm caused by her daughter's decisions and by the broader corporate culture that had allowed those decisions to go unchecked for so long. Beyond the apology, she presented Logan with a new contract for future deliveries, this one built around transparent inspection standards and independent safety verification, terms designed specifically to prevent the kind of concealment that had nearly cost lives within the rescue vehicle program. Logan accepted cautiously, recognizing the gesture as meaningful even while understanding that trust between them would need time to fully rebuild. Evelyn Moore continued her reporting well after the trial concluded, publishing a series of follow-up articles that examined broader gaps in oversight across municipal infrastructure contracts throughout the region. Her work contributed directly to new legislation requiring independent third-party verification for safety-critical components used in emergency response vehicles, a change that regulators credited in part to the public attention generated by Logan's case. It was a quiet but lasting form of impact, the kind that extended protection to countless future situations far removed from the original confrontation at a construction site gate. Amelia Langford disappeared from public corporate life almost entirely following her removal from leadership, her name absent from the industry gatherings and business publications that had once celebrated her rapid rise. No statement of regret followed her departure, no attempt at redemption through public apology, only silence as she stepped away from the world that had once revolved around her ambition. Logan, meanwhile, stood one evening outside his newly repaired shop, watching the sun lower behind the same industrial skyline that had witnessed his humiliation months earlier. His old gray truck sat parked nearby, freshly restored, its dents smoothed and its engine running as steadily as ever. He thought briefly of how easily the world had once dismissed him as insignificant, and how a single quiet insistence on truth had ultimately proven strong enough to bring down an empire built on convenience and cruelty. It was not the outcome he had set out to achieve that first morning, only the simple, stubborn refusal to let injustice pass unanswered, but it had become something far larger than either he or Amelia Langford could have imagined when this story began. This is what happens when power forgets that dignity does not depend on wealth or title. Amelia Langford believed a battered truck and a quiet mechanic were beneath her notice, small enough to push aside without consequence. She never imagined that the man she humiliated in front of an entire construction crew was carrying proof of a danger her own company had chosen to ignore. Logan Carter never raised his voice, never demanded revenge, never sought public sympathy. He simply insisted on the truth, one document at a time, one witness at a time, until an empire built on convenience finally answered for what it had buried. If this story reminded you that patience and integrity can outlast arrogance, share it with someone who needs that reminder today.